Welcome to another episode of the ASF Podcast. My name is Tanja Janko, and I am the host of the science vertical of the ASF Podcast. In this season, we are exploring consciousness and philosophy of mind and the nature of self from a wide range of perspectives. So far this season, we heard from thinkers like Philip Goff, Carl Friston, and David Pena Guzman, and each has offered a distinct vision ranging from panpsychism to predictive processing and to animal consciousness. Today, we are joined by philosopher Jay Garfield, who brings a completely different perspective. Jay is one of the world's leading scholars in Buddhist philosophy and cross-cultural philosophy. He taught at Smith College and Harvard Divinity School and has written extensively on ethics, metaphysics, and the philosophy of mind. One of his more recent books, Losing Ourselves, Learning to Live Without a Self, explores the Buddhist idea that the self is an illusion, but that letting go of this illusion can actually help us live more ethically and freely. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So you work extensively across tradition of Indian Buddhist philosophy, Western analytic philosophy, and Tibetan philosophical texts. So how did you first become interested in doing philosophy and philosophy across cultures?
That's a long and amusing story, but the short answer to that is that I was dragged into it by student interest. My training was entirely in Western philosophy, and when I began my first teaching job at Hampshire College, 1980, which now seems like a very long time ago, my very first student who walked into my office wanted me to work with him on a project on relationships between medieval Tibetan philosophy and early modern European philosophy. And I was quite surprised by this, having never even realized there was such a thing as Tibetan philosophy. But I worked with him on that project, and it was truly interesting, and put it down for a long time because I had other things to do in cognitive science and logic. But then a few years later, when our college introduced a very strong multicultural requirement, I realized the only non-Western culture I knew anything about at all was medieval Tibetan philosophy. So I went back in that direction and started trying to study just enough to incorporate in some of my classes, and it gradually became an area of research for me, and in the end became a large part of what I do.
Okay, very nice. Okay, so just to begin our conversation, let's maybe set the stage with talking about what actually Buddhist philosophy is, how it differentiates between religious Buddhism, and how does it approach these big questions like mind, identity, and ethics?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I'm going to begin by trying to point out some of the similarities as well as some of the differences between the relationship between philosophy and religion in the West and the relationship between philosophy and religion in the Buddhist world. And one of the first things I have to say is that just as the West is a very big place, so if one asks the question, as some of my Tibetan colleagues sometimes do, what do Western philosophers think about the mind? You have to say, well, there's a lot of Western philosophers and they think of a lot of different things. I would also have to say, when we ask the question, what do Buddhist philosophers think about the mind? There's a lot of different Buddhist philosophers and they think a lot of different things because the Buddhist tradition is every bit as vast and complex and involved in controversy as the Western philosophical tradition is. But let me come back to the question about philosophy and religion. If we had asked this question about the Western tradition, say in the 15th century, people would have looked at you like you were crazy. What do you mean the difference between philosophy and religion? Philosophy is part of religion. Because up until the Galileo controversy, philosophy in the West, whether it was Jewish philosophy, Islamic philosophy, or Christian philosophy, was conducted entirely within the religious framework. It was only when Galileo broke with the church that philosophers had to choose sides and decide whether philosophy was going to continue to be a kind of sub-branch of theology or whether it was going to join the new sciences that were forming. So when we talk about the difference between philosophy and religion in the West, we're really talking about something that is a kind of post-Enlightenment phenomenon. When philosophy cast its lot with the sciences and broke off from Catholic or Islamic or Jewish religious traditions. But it's also important to recognize that when we talk about philosophy in the West, even though it sees itself as allied closely with the sciences, its religious background has never really dropped off. And that's something that is sometimes hard to see and that I never really saw until I began working cross-culturally and looked back at Western philosophy from a Buddhist perspective. So just to take one example, one of my favorite examples, Western philosophers treat, say, the so-called problem of the freedom of the will as though that's a kind of perennial philosophical question that has to do with causation and life and so forth that anybody should ask. And they're sometimes puzzled that nobody in the Asian tradition asks the question, gee, what's the relationship between free will and determinism? Well, there's a reason for that. The problem of the freedom of the will is a result of Saint Augustine's, one of our early philosophers, attempt to solve the theodicy problem, to try to absolve God from responsibility for the fall from Eden. So if you come from a tradition that doesn't believe in talking snakes and mythical gardens and trees of good and evil, then the problem of the freedom of the will doesn't even occur. It's a religious problem we start thinking of as a philosophical problem. If we look at Kant's ethics again, what we see is kind of Lutheran theology stripped of its theological language. And this goes through a lot of Western philosophy. So when sometimes people say, gee, Buddhist philosophy, that's just religious because it's in a religious tradition, I want to say, so you would prefer what Descartes does, for instance. They say, yes. I mean, I'll say, remember, Descartes began by proving the existence of God. Western philosophy is deeply implicated with religion. And then what we try to do when we try to treat philosophy non-religiously is to separate out the pieces of it and the ideas and the methods that aren't as closely tied to specifically theological tenets. Mutatis mutandis, the story is the same in the Buddhist world. So for sure, the Buddhist religious tradition is a tradition that involves a lot of religious practice. I'm always amused when my students earnestly say to me, Buddhism isn't really a religion, it's really just a philosophical system or a worldview. And I remind them of all of the Buddhist prayers and rituals and monastic institutions and so forth that make Buddhism look very much like a Western religion. The word religion itself, religio, means something that binds us. And the word dharma, which is what Buddhists would call their doctrine at dharma, comes from the same root. It means to hold or to bind. So there's an enormous amount of similarity in that respect. But just as in the West, religious practices and religious traditions gave rise to systems of reasoning and analysis and ways of understanding phenomena that we can divorce from specifically religious practices. Philosophy in the Buddhist tradition has also developed in ways that divorce it from specifically religious practices and religious doctrines. Now, having said that, I want to also say that philosophy has a very special place in the Buddhist religious framework. And that has to do with the very fundamental ideas of Buddhism, religious ideas, but religious ideas that make philosophy very important. The Buddhist world begins, or Buddhist thinking begins, with the very first talk or sermon or speech, no matter whatever you want to call it, that the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, gave to his 5 initial disciples in Sarnath. And at that, he enunciated what are called the 4 noble or the 4 ennobling truths in Buddhism, which function as the foundation for all of Buddhist thought. The first one of those is that the world is permeated by suffering. We're going to leave that one aside for now, but I'll bet we'll come back to it at some point. But the second truth is that the root of suffering, the reason that there's so much suffering in the world, has to do with attraction to things we can't have and aversion to things that we end up with. So, if people are familiar in your podcast with Janis Joplin's music, they can think about her great song, Lord, Won't You Buy Me a Mercedes-Benz? Right? Janis isn't suffering because she doesn't have a Mercedes-Benz. She's suffering because she doesn't have one and she wants one. And the Buddha argued then that the root of attachment and aversion, the reasons that we want so many things that we don't have, the reason that we're averse to so many things that we do have, is a fundamental primal confusion about the nature of reality, a misunderstanding of how things really are. And that misunderstanding involves both a misunderstanding of the nature of the objects of experience and the nature of our own subjectivity. and hence a misunderstanding of the conditions of true happiness. Now, if Buddhism is set out to solve this fundamental problem, namely the problem of the ubiquity of suffering, and if the cause of suffering is confusion about the nature of reality, then the central aspect of the solution to that problem is getting clear about the nature of reality. And Buddhist philosophy, just like Western philosophy, is aimed primarily at getting clear about the nature of reality, which means getting clear about the nature of the objects we encounter, but also getting clear about the nature of our own subjectivity and the relationship between subjectivity and objects. So for that reason, the pursuit of analytical philosophy, of carefully analyzing objects, carefully analyzing knowledge, carefully analyzing subjectivity, is, while a philosophical project, also within Buddhism, a central piece of the religious project. And that's why philosophy has a very special relationship to the Buddhist religious practice, but also because it's aimed at this disinterested understanding of the nature of reality, something that we can abstract from Buddhist religious commitments and practices and examine in its own right. And one of the things that happens when we do that and put Western philosophers and Buddhist philosophers into dialogue, something I've been spending the last 30, 40 years doing, we discover that there's a lot of good conversation to be had, a lot of commonalities between the kinds of ideas that Western philosophers develop and that Buddhist philosophers develop, a lot of commonality between the kinds of problems they address, the questions they ask, and the conversations can indeed be extraordinarily fruitful. My own feeling is that Western philosophers, when they encounter and take Buddhist philosophy seriously, not only come to know more about Buddhist philosophy, but they come to understand Western philosophy more deeply by looking at it from a position of hermeneutic distance. And I also find that my Tibetan and Indian colleagues come to understand their tradition more deeply by allowing themselves to take a stance from Western philosophy and say, this is something that we could learn. So this is why this whole process is so valuable.
Exactly. And I also feel like sometimes in the West, whenever we're looking at philosophy, we view all the non-Western philosophies as a little bit of not on the same level as the Western analytic philosophy. So what do you think Western philosophy could still learn from Indian, Buddhist, and other non-Western traditions? Because there's so many out there. Yeah, we really are. I feel like focusing a little bit too much on the Western traditions.
Yeah, there's two important things to say at the beginning there. The first is that while I've been talking about Buddhist philosophy, I could have given you the same sermon regarding Taoist philosophy, regarding Confucian philosophy, regarding Native American philosophy. If you really are seriously interested in philosophy, you should be studying philosophy in each of the world's traditions. Not to do that is irresponsible in at least 3 or 4 ways. First of all, it's frankly racist, and you actually alluded to that in your question. For people who look like you and me to decide without studying it that philosophy done by people from Africa or people from Asia or people from the Islamic world or from the Americas has to be less interesting than their own. And they decide that long before they study it, of course. They say, that's the reason I don't study it, because I know that it's not as good or not as rigorous. The only way they could know that would be either by clairvoyance or racism. And since most Western philosophers don't claim clairvoyance, I think we have to think about that as a kind of racism. So there's something deeply immoral about ignoring the philosophy of other traditions. That's especially so because through no fault of our own, but just as a matter of fact, you and I live and think in the shadow of colonialism. And part of the project of colonialism was the assertion of a kind of European superiority. So to the degree that we allow that to continue in our own practice, we are continuing the project of colonialism by other means. And that's something that I think is deeply immoral and politically problematic. There's also an epistemological folly about doing that, because it would be simply astounding if the only good ideas that had ever been had would have been had by people who look like you and me. One way to think about that is, imagine somebody who said, I only read books and articles published on Mondays and Wednesdays. And you said, what? You ask why? They say, well, there's so much good literature published on Mondays and Wednesdays that if I Even if I just spend my whole life doing that, I'll never finish it all. So there's no time to read what happens on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays and Saturdays. You'd say, this person's insane, right? They are deliberately depriving themselves of all of the insights that have been published on other days of the week. And that would be insane. But somebody who says to themselves, gosh, the Western tradition is so full of good ideas, I only have time to study stuff written by white people, is epistemologically just as irresponsible and depriving themselves of the insights to be found in other traditions. A third reason that it's kind of irresponsible is because many of us are in positions of kind of intellectual power, to put it bluntly. That is, we're teachers or department chairs or people responsible for building university curriculum and for educating the next generation of scholars. And if we don't introduce philosophy from other traditions into our practice, we deprive the next generation of scholars of insights, and we pass the legacy of colonialism and epistemic idiocy on to the next generation. So I think that there's honestly no decent defense for pursuing philosophy multiculturally. There's also, of course, a self-interest in all of this, and that is that our students want this. So that if you actually want enrollments in your philosophy courses, I say to my colleagues, don't just study white studies. So that's part of the sermon. But then the second part of your question was, what can we learn? Well, we can learn a lot. I would say that every philosophical tradition I've encountered has got some insights, some way of putting things, some arguments that other traditions don't have. And that doesn't mean that there's one that's better than all of the others. It means that each tradition is better when augmented by others. And by the way, the prejudice we've been talking about is not just a prejudice of Westerners. When I began working with Tibetan colleagues many years ago, I would often get the following response when I proposed that they study Western texts. It would be, oh yes, the West is really good at science and technology, and we're really good to get the science and technology from the West. But everybody knows that Westerners can't do philosophy. They can't think deeply. They can only think about material things. And it took me a while to convince a lot of my Tibetan colleagues that Westerners could think too. So the prejudice isn't just one that we have, and that's really important to see. A lot of the people upon whom we look down as not being able to think, look down on us for not being able to think as well. So we ought to get used to that. So for instance, when we think about a doctrine like the two truths that we get out of Indo-Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, the idea of a relationship between a conventional truth and an ultimate truth, and that the ultimate truth about things is that they're empty of any intrinsic nature. That's not an idea that we get in that form in the Western world, though we get some companion ideas that it can be used to clarify. Or when we look at ways of partitioning logical space, so much of Western logic has partitioned logical space into only two regions, truth and falsity. But very early on, Buddhist philosophers were saying, no, there's a fourfold partition that's possible. We can talk about truth, falsity, both, and neither. Now, that idea did arise in the West. It arose in the West in roughly the middle of the 20th century when Jan Lukasiewicz was developing the beginnings of modal logic. It arose in the 1st century BCE in the Buddhist tradition. So if you wanted to know what philosophy would look like if you took four valuational logics seriously from the beginning, Buddhist philosophy looks very different. As a consequence, Buddhist philosophy is often much more comfortable with paradox than Western philosophy is. Western philosophy, being built largely on an Aristotelian framework, sees contradiction as something that's intolerable. Buddhist philosophy, born in a tradition that takes the Chatuskoti or four-cornered logic seriously, sees contradiction as an interesting possibility and also sees truth-value gaps as an interesting possibility. Those ideas are getting currency now in the West, especially because of the needs of database logics and things like that. But those raise philosophical ideas that Buddhists have worked on for many, many years. And I think that makes life much more interesting. Contemporary cognitive science has worried a lot about the nature of mental representation and what the interface between conscious life and an external world would be like. And if we didn't think of that dualistically as mind standing outside of worlds in the way that Augustine and Descartes did, without an inner and an outer. Buddhists have been working on that since the 3rd century. So there's a lot to be done there, and there's a lot that's very useful.
Exactly. So So normally, whenever you're thinking about yourself, I feel like the most intuitive way to think about yourself is in a dualist way, because you don't perceive yourself and your body in kind of the same way. So now I want to use this as a little way to go into your book. And I want to jump into a little thought experiment that you have in your book. So you describe this thought experiment like imagining borrowing Stephen Hawking's mind or Usain Bolt's body. And these show that we think of ourselves as owners of a body or of a mind and not identical with either. So could you explain this thought experiment and what does this reveal about our implicit dualism?
Sure. And it's important to see that this thought experiment is not meant to mean that it's possible to have somebody else's body or somebody else's mind, but only to convince us that before we think about it too clearly, too carefully, we take ourselves to be able to do that. And that shows something about our naive, pre-reflective, immediate sense of who we are. And first, here's what I take it to show, then I'm going to work through the thought experiment. I think that human beings, and this is obvious, have been evolved to be susceptible to all kinds of illusions. That's not news. Everybody knows that they're susceptible to the Mueller-Lyer illusion or the color phi illusion. Everybody knows about auditory illusions that can be induced, click location illusions in speech and so forth. So we're used to perceptual illusions. And we know that what that reflects is the fact that our perceptual systems have evolved to give us quick, continuous information about the world around us and to guide motion, not to be completely accurate, because perfect accuracy in reflecting the nature of the world isn't what gives us survival value. It's not what enables us to live long enough to reproduce and enable our children to reproduce. Quick and dirty perceptual systems are really good at that. So we already know about that. Now, one of the intuitions that I derived from Buddhist philosophy, and footnote, Hume noticed the same thing in the 18th century in Scotland, but leave that aside now, is that the idea of the self is also an illusion for which we've evolved. There's an interesting question about why we did and how we did, and we could talk about that later perhaps. But I think that it's a very powerful illusion. And the moment we focus on its nature, we see that it's really crazy. So here's the thought experiment. And the thought experiment, again, is not meant to show that something is possible, just that we can do it conatively. So I ask people, I say, look, I want you to imagine somebody's body that you'd like to have, maybe forever, maybe just for a few minutes, maybe just for a few seconds. And of course, I tell my students, you don't have to tell me who it is. This might be deeply personal and deeply embarrassing, but I can tell you whose body I'd like to have for a short while. And that would be Usain Bolt's body when he was in his prime, because I'd love to know what it feels like to run 100 meters in 9.5 seconds. And if I had, it doesn't help that, I don't want to be Usain Bolt, because Usain Bolt is already Usain Bolt, and that doesn't do any good for me. I would like me, Jay, to be in Usain Bolt's body doing that, so I'd know what that feels like. Now, I don't think that that's possible or even coherent or cogent, but I think I can get the desire going. And if I can get the desire going, then I know that when I pre-reflectively think about who I am, I don't think of myself as identical to my body. I think of myself who happens to have a kind of old, broken down body that was never very fast at the beginning, but would love to have a young, strong, extremely fast body. Now, that shows me that I don't think of myself as my body. But I can do the same thing with regard to a mind. It might be Stephen Hawking. Lately it's been Carlo Rovelli, because I'd really love to understand quantum gravity. And I can't really understand quantum gravity. The mathematics is just way beyond me. But if I just had Carlo's mind for a few minutes, then I would know what it was like to understand quantum gravity. And that would be so cool. Now, when I decide that I want to have Carlo's mind, I don't want to be Carlo, right? I don't want to live where Carlo lives. It doesn't help me at all to be Carlo, because then Jay wouldn't know anything. I want to know what it would be like for me, Jay, to have Carlo's mind. Again, I don't think that makes any sense, but I can desire it. If I can desire it, then that tells me that I pre-reflectively think of myself not as my mind, but as somebody who's got a mind that's an instrument that mediates between me and the world and enables me to know it. The moment I get those things in focus, I realize that my pre-reflective, stupid, sense of what I am is something that is neither mind nor body, but the thing that has a mind and a body. That's the thing that's kind of the origin of the Greek notion of a psyche, the Christian notion of a soul, the Hindu notion of an Atman. It's a perennial cross-cultural idea. And I think it comes from the fact that we are each wired for this self-illusion, the illusion that we're something not in the world, but that stands against the world. Buddhists call that the illusion of subject-object duality, the idea that we as subject are completely different from all objects, and that our mind, our mental states, our bodies, the things outside of us are all the objects that we experience, but the subject is just the pure experiencer. And that has got to be crazy, right? Because if I ask you, where are you right now? You're not going to say I'm outside of space and time experiencing the spatio-temporal world. That would be nuts, but that's how we think of ourselves. One of the beautiful ways that that's put by a Western philosopher, again as an illusion, is by Ludwig Wittgenstein in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And Wittgenstein said, we often think of ourselves as like standing to the world in the way that the eye stands to the visual field. We don't see our eyes. Our eyes are outside of the visual field and enable the visual field to be known to us. And similarly, we think of the self not as in the world, but as standing outside the world and making the world evident. The moment you say, I am outside of the world and act on it and experience it, you're crazy. The problem is that until we think about it carefully, that's how we all think about ourselves most of the time. And that's the beginning of the Buddhist philosophical diagnosis of primal confusion.
So where did this idea of soul originate?
Well, I think that the philosophical idea of a soul, or the philosophical idea of an Atman or a self or a psyche, whatever you want to call it, originates as a way of trying to make philosophical sense out of this illusion. And the illusion is so strong that we end up trying to make philosophical sense of it. But it's impossible, because it would be as though somebody drew the Mueller-Lyer illusion and then spent the rest of their life trying to figure out how drawing little arrowheads on the end of lines makes them longer and shorter. What's important to explain is not why lines get longer or shorter when we draw arrowheads on them, but why we see them that way. Similarly, I think what's important is not trying to figure out what the nature of this self is, because there isn't any such thing, but rather to try to understand why and how we construct this sense of self and to eliminate it.
If we are thinking about having this idea of no self, which is central to this Buddhist thought, how can we think of this in a non-nihilistic way? Because for me, initially, my first thing is then to think about nihilism, that nothing makes sense. So what does exist if no self? And how can we not think about this idea in a non-nihilistic terms?
Yeah, that's a very good, a very important question. Buddhism always presents itself, no matter what Buddhist school we're looking at, as a middle path between two extremes. And in fact, in that very first talk that the Buddha gave, he said to his disciples, I'm teaching you a path by the middle, avoiding extremes. Now, philosophically and metaphysically, the two extremes against which Buddhist philosophy takes itself to be counterposed are the extremes of reification and the extremes of nihilism. So the extreme of reification would be seeing that we have this sense of self and then trying to pin down what that self is and to theorize it and hypothesize it. The extreme of nihilism would be to say that since we don't have any self, we don't exist at all. That would be really crazy. I'll give some analogies in a minute, but the short answer to start with is that when we ask what we are, Buddhists in particular in this Madhyamaka school, this middle way school that I work in, say what we are persons, not selves, and that persons are causally open, continually changing continua of psychophysical processes, and you don't find anything that answers to a self in them. That's very, very similar. Anybody who studied Western philosophy will notice to Hume, saying that we're bundles of constantly changing perceptions with no self or subject. And there are historical reasons for that commonality as well. But the point here is not that we say that we don't exist. That would be crazy. But to say that the way we exist is different from the way that we appear. And I want to focus on that really, really importantly, because when we say that the self is an illusion, Some people think that what that means is that we hallucinate who we are. But illusions are different from hallucinations. When you hallucinate, you simply see something that's not there. When you experience an illusion, you see something that exists in one way but appears in another. So to take some familiar Buddhist examples of illusions, when you see a mirage, you see a refraction pattern of light that appears to be water. When you see a face in a mirror, you see light reflecting off of a surface that appears to be somebody looking at you. When you hear an echo, you hear your voice reflecting from a cliff that sounds like somebody calling to you. In each case, we have something that exists in one way, but appears to exist in another. And that's what it is for something to be illusory. So to come back to my favorite example, the Mueller-Lyer illusion, we're seeing two equally length lines that appear to be lines of different lengths. So when we talk about the illusion of self, what we're saying is that we exist in one way, but appear to ourselves to exist in another. We appear to exist as continuing pure subjects exempt from causality outside of the world, but we're in fact constantly changing and developing sets of causally open psychophysical processes. And so it's a confusion of one thing with another thing. That's why it's not nihilistic. You and I are two persons talking to one another, but we're not two selves looking at each other through minds and bodies. We're two continua of psychophysical processes miraculously interacting through the internet. And that's very, very different. One of the things that does is to allow us to begin, when we take that seriously, to experience ourselves as immanent in the world, immersed in the world, rather than standing against the world. We're not like the relationship of the eye to the visual field. We're just like every other object in the world, in causal relation with every other object in the world. And that's a very, very different way of seeing ourselves and understanding who we are. I think that's really important, and that gives us a much deeper insight into what human nature looks like.
One interesting idea, I mean, of course, now I wanted to go a little bit, let's say, off script, but recently I read one of the Buddhist books, and it's talked about the 9 stages of meditations on death that is practiced in Buddhism. And that is also quite interesting. I guess this is to kind of decouple yourself from your perception of self, if I understand this correctly.
It is really important there because it gets at another aspect of subject-object duality and of why it's deeply confused. Because oftentimes, and I think this is true of many people, especially in the Abrahamic traditions in the West, we grow up thinking of death as a sudden event at the end of life. And so we think that there's first life, then there's death, and they're completely different phenomena. And what the meditative practice that you're discussing teaches us is that just as human person and world are non-dually related, that human persons are part of the world, not standing against it, life and death are non-dually related. And one way to see that is that we're dying at every moment. Different ways to see that. One is the kind of big picture way of seeing that. Every moment that we live is one step closer to our death. And as one of my Tibetan colleagues says, we need to learn to think of ourselves as corpses in progress. And I think that's important because it reminds us again that we're biological processes that are quite finite and that entropy guarantees that we're sliding downhill all the time. The other piece of that, though, that I think is maybe even more profound, is that when we think about who we are as continua of processes, rather than as individuals constantly changing, we recognize that who I am right now is dying before who I am right now emerges. So at each second, the being we are is ceasing to exist, and a new being is coming into existence as a causal descendant of that earlier being. And so death is something that's happening at every moment, not simply something that happens at the end of life. And I think that can allow us to face death with a little more equanimity and clarity. And it also means that, when we leave one aspect of our life behind, as, when we graduate from high school or we graduate from college or we retire, a part of us has died. And that's a rehearsal for that later death. And it's worth recognizing that's happening all the time. And death isn't some horrible thing to be avoided. Rather, it's something that we're doing at every moment of our life.
Yeah, true. So you talked about illusions, paradoxes, and another book, also pretty famous book from Douglas Hofstadter, so Gödel, Escher, Bach, also uses Zen koans, paradoxes, illusions, strange loops to explore how systems become self-referential, how consciousness might arise from recursive patterns. So it seems like your work and the work of Hofstadter is kind of connected in a way.
I think our views are connected, but nonetheless different. I think there's a lot that Hofstadter did in that book with which I agree. And then there are some things with which I disagree. So I want to focus on the places where I disagree to sharpen. And again, that's not to say there isn't a lot with which I agree. There is. One is that I disagree with the way that Hofstadter uses Zen koan. He sees koan as illogical, as ways to break out of reasoning or out of logic. But as I read the Chan or Zen tradition, I see koans as ways of forcing us to think more clearly and rationally about things about which we tend to think irrationally. So where Hofstadter sees them as taking us out of reason, I see them as taking us back into reason, though in unexpected and surprising ways. The second respect of it, I think, is more important for this discussion in which we disagree, is that for all of Hofstadter's discussion of lack of a sort of single core or a central meaner, as Dan Dennett used to put it, he still sees subjectivity and objectivity as distinct from one another. So when he's trying to understand consciousness as arising out of strange loops, he's still distinguishing conscious systems from the things of which they are conscious. And when you look at all of his examples, they're beautiful examples. They're very elegant examples. The way that he interprets them is a way of getting a representation of an external reality into an inner world. And so he's thinking in terms of isomorphism. And thinking of consciousness or cognition in terms of isomorphism is a subtler and more sophisticated way of prosecuting what, again, to my favorite nemesis, St. Augustine, was doing when he, in the Meditations and in the City of God, begins talking about the inner world in which there are ideas or thoughts that resemble things in the outer world, and that we know the outer world first by knowing the inner world, and then by using the isomorphism between inner and outer to draw inference about the outer. That's the seductive metaphor of inside and outside, of self and other. And that's a way of reinscribing that duality. So while I think that Doug Hofstadter in that book had a very sophisticated way of understanding a dualistic model of consciousness, that model of consciousness was still resolutely dualistic, that it still offers us a way of understanding the external world through an isomorph of that world in the inner world. And that's why all of that work on isomorphism in Gödel, Escher, Bach. So I think that's what Buddhism is actually trying to deconstruct, as not just the notion of a single center of consciousness, but the idea that there's a distinction between subjectivity and objectivity, and that knowledge of the external world is through some kind of isomorph in the first place. That's where we disagree.
So you also before mentioned David Hume. So you draw parallels between Buddhist thinkers and him. So he also doubted the existence of a self. So can you maybe explain the parallels between Buddhist views and David Hume?
Yeah, I think the parallels are all over the place. That Hume's ethics looks a great deal like Buddhist ethics, focusing very much on how we experience the world rather than on how we act. Hume's critique of the self and his reconstruction of the person as a bundle of causally connected, constantly changing perceptions is very much like the Buddhist world. Hume's fundamental idea that the kind of reality that persons have, that justification has, that ethical norms have, is conventional, and that they're empty of any intrinsic basis, is very, very similar to the Madhyamaka idea in Buddhism. And I think that the reason for that is actually literally historical. When we look at the time classically, when India and Greece were in deepest kind of conversation, the Alexandrian and post-Alexandrian period, which is when Pyrrhonian skepticism evolved, we see a lot of dialogue between early Buddhist thinkers, the Prasangika Madhyamaka thinkers, and Greek skeptics. Remember that Pyrrho, after whom Pyrrhonian skepticism is named, traveled to India. And we know from Diogenes Laertius what he came back saying. And a lot of what he came back saying are quotations from Buddhist scriptures. And so I think what we have in that nexus, that philosophical nexus that was developed in Bactria and Persia between Indian and Greek thought, was the arising of the skeptical tradition. And Hume, of course, reading through Bayle, was deeply involved in the revival of Pyrrhonian skepticism. And so I think it's that same tradition that gives rise a few centuries later in India to Madhyamaka, and many centuries later to Humean skepticism in Scotland. And so I think that's where the cool nexus is. I think that's kind of nice. And what you see there, the deepest insight that you see there, is the insight that our collective conventions, ways of talking and ways of thinking, are not grounded in an independently existent reality that we all detect and to which we react, but rather that the reality that we live, that we inhabit, is a reality that is created by conventional structures. That's the idea of the two truths, and that's also the idea of Humean conventionalism and skepticism.
Now I also have a question from a bit of a scientific perspective. So how does neuroscience provide empirical support or challenges the non-self view?
In my view, everything that's happening in contemporary neuroscience provides deep support for the no-self view. And I mean, a lot of that is just so obvious that it almost doesn't require saying. If we look at the way our brains are structured and our nervous systems are structured, we don't see a central spot where everything comes together that remains unchanged. There's no little video monitor in the prefrontal cortex that's kind of telling you what's happening every place else. Instead, we see a great deal of distributed processing that to introspection looks as though there's a single subjective point of view. But if we look at it from a processing point of view, there is nothing like that at all. Moreover, when we look at the way in which the perceptual motor interface kind of with the world works, we don't see first the construction of perceptions, then decisions being made about those, then impulses to the motor system going. Rather, we see a constant reciprocal feedback loop between motor systems, perceptual systems, conative and affective systems, cognitive systems, with no single directionality at all. The kind of old computational myth that first we get perceptual information, then we construct representations, then we feed that to cognition, and then cognition feeds that to a conative system, which then enables a motor system, is just crazy. And there's nothing in a mammalian neural architecture that looks like that at all. So I think that, if what we're asking for, if somebody says, gee, where do neuroscientists think the self is located? The answer is they don't. And it's not because they haven't found it yet, but it's because no practicing neuroscientist would take the idea of a self in that way seriously. That instead we are embedded in our worlds, and the way that our nervous system works is a way of coordinating an embedded organism with the environment in which it's embedded, not a self that is now representing the way the world is faithfully. It also, I think, is really important to see that when we look at what we know from neuroscience, but also what a lot of Buddhist philosophers speculated about from the 2nd and 3rd century of the CE on, is that perception isn't somehow the deliverance of the world as it is to an inner representation that then mirrors that world in the way that, say, Augustine and Descartes thought it was, and the way, for that matter, Hofstadter thinks of it. Instead, if you get really to be really boring about it, when I'm looking at a white calla lily, light is bouncing off of that lily. It's entering, my eye, getting turned upside down, refracted through clear jelly, causing electrochemical impulses on the back of my retina that are sent to my occipital cortex through two different pathways, one dorsal and one ventral, and then a whole bunch of stuff is happening. And there's no white lily anywhere in my brain. There's no representation of a white lily anywhere in my brain. There's simply information in my brain that's refracted from that. But it's worth pointing out that if a bee is looking at that same lily, a bee is seeing a whole bunch of spots and a bullseye at the center of that lily, not a uniform white field, because the bee is seeing in the infrared and the ultraviolet spectrum. And if you were now to ask the really important question, the really cool question, So who's right, me or the bee? What does the lily really look like? Is it uniformly white, or is there a red bullseye in the center and a bunch of blue dots on it? The answer is there is no way the lily looks. So there is no representation in a bee's brain or my brain that would give us the lily as it looks. The lily is empty of any of that. The color, the appearance is all constructed by a complicated set of neurological processes. That's not the replication of a representation that matches something in reality. That's a collective, collaborative construction of reality. It's a collaboration between the world outside of my body and the world inside of my body. And there's no self in that, and there's no object in that. There's a non-dual, constant interaction between a bunch of processes. No, nothing more. So I think neuroscience.
So one important thing that is left to address, I think, is also how do we think of ourselves as persisting through time? So as I understand, the Buddhist view resists this. And you also gave a very nice metaphor in your book. So the lamp metaphor, there was a lamp and it would only, it was a small lamp and then it would die every so often. And during the night, you would have to light it up again. Or the previous lamp would pass the flame through to the next one. And then the question whether this is the same flame that started at the beginning of the night as in the morning, where this was a couple of lamps after. So can you maybe talk a little bit about this? And so how do we perceive about our perception of a self through time? And how does this challenges our understanding of agency, memory, even personal growth maybe?
I'm going to begin to answer that question first by taking you through the example that you introduced, and then offering two more examples to take us steadily deeper into this one, okay? Because I think it's really important, and it connects to the sense in which persons are real and persist through time, but selves are not. So the example that you recalled is one that comes from a lovely Pali text called The Questions of King Milinda. And it occurs in the context where it's a dialogue between a king and a Buddhist monk, and the king, by the way, this comes from Bactria, which was a Greek Buddhist kingdom in what's now Afghanistan. So it's one of those places where that nexus between Western philosophy and Indian philosophy was really developing. And so after the monk Nagasena argues against the existence of the self, the king says, well, then what kind of thing am I? And Nagasena says, well, imagine this, king. You know how you have a lamp in your room at night, and a servant lights it at the beginning of the night. The lamp only lasts a few hours. And so then they come in and they light the next lamp from the flame of the first lamp, and then the next lamp from the flame of the second lamp, so that in the morning that flame is still there. And he says, so what would you say? Is the flame in the morning the same as the flame in the evening? Well, in one sense, yes. It's been burning continuously and passed from lamp to lamp. But in another sense, no, because at one point it was the flame on the first lamp, and now it's the flame on the third or fourth lamp. And so it's a different flame that has been caused to be lit by the earlier ones. It's just the same thing with a person. There's a sense in which you don't persist through time. As I said earlier, you die every moment. But each moment is a causal descendant of the previous moment. And their connectedness makes it quite sensible to say you're the same person, just as we can say it's the same flame that was passed from lamp to lamp. Now, let me point out that we do this kind of thing all the time. So, for instance, I recently retired from teaching at Smith College, and Smith College was founded in 1875. And so if I were to ask, did I teach in 2025, same college that was founded in 1875? Well, yes, that's why it's 150 years old. But it's got different students, different teachers, different buildings, different books in the library. So it's much bigger. So it's certainly in many ways, if I looked at the college I taught in and the college that was founded back then, they were very different. But because they're causally connected and constantly evolving, we say, yes, this college is that old, which means it existed for that length of time. And if you were to ask, well, what's the piece of it that existed through all that time? There's no piece at all. Rather, we have a convention for individuating colleges that allows us to do that, just as we have a convention for individuating persons that transcends the momentary differences. Now I want to take it one step deeper. And this is a suggestion from my lovely wife, who once asked a Tibetan colleague of mine to explain this issue to her. And he said, you can think of a person as like a river, but don't think that that means you're identical to the water. It's not the water, it's the flow. That's what remains constant over time, not the water. There's no self, no bit of water that's the same from moment to moment. But that continual flow, the relationship between water, is something that continues. When we think about it that way, we see that there's nothing unreal about persons. Persons are as real as flows. They're as real as colleges. They're as real as flames. But that doesn't mean that they are selves any more than there's something continuous in that burning gas that makes it the same flame, or some single thing that goes through the history of a college, or the same water present in the river now that was present in it before. So when Heraclitus says you can't step into the same river twice, we want to say yes and no. Yes, you can't step into the same water, but you can step into the same river. The river is something that exists conventionally like a person, whereas the water is something that's constantly changing.
So for the last part, I would just like to talk a little bit about consciousness, because this is also the theme of this fourth season.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you, from your perspective, what is consciousness?
Okay. I think it's nothing at all, because I think that we have a dangerous, illicit reification when we go from the relation of being conscious, so that I am conscious of what you've just said, or you are conscious of what I just said, to a thing called consciousness that may, in virtue of which we are conscious. So I want to give just a really stupid, simple example. Suppose that I'm standing next to you and somebody says, yeah, Jay is standing next to Tanja, but in virtue of what? Is there where's the next to-ness that's in there? Are there three things? Jay, Tanja, and next to-ness? Well, we'd think, no, that's stupid. You don't understand what a relation is. A relation's a relation between things. So when I say that I'm conscious of a coffee cup, or conscious of a sunset, or even conscious of my own cognitive processes, that means that those things are causally effective in my cognition. That means that they have downstream effects in my cognitive processes. But I don't have to have a ness, a thing, a substance in virtue of which that happens. So I think that what happens, and I think this is a problem that bedevils the entire consciousness industry, when we start asking what's the locus of consciousness, that's like asking what's the locus of next to-ness, or the locus of northness or southness. We're mistaking a relation between a cognitive system and the things that affect it, and a substantial kind of thing. I think it's an entire confusion. And I think that it's built into that idea of subject-object duality that we talked about earlier. The moment you decide that the subject is different from the object, then you ask, in virtue of what is that subject a subject? And you say, oh, it's because it has consciousness. That's like saying, when we notice that some things are north of other things and the other things are south of those things, we say, in virtue of what is it north? Oh, it must have northness in it. Now, where's the seat of northness? People would think we were crazy if we did that. So when I say that consciousness is an illusion, I don't mean that we're never conscious. We're conscious of a lot of things. But I think that the idea that the fact that we're conscious means that we have consciousness, that's an illusion.
Interesting.
Let me go one step further with that. I think a lot of the contemporary discussion of consciousness got going in a very famous essay by Tom Nagel that everybody in this field has read now, called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Right? And Nagel said at the end, there's no way that we could ever know what it's like to be a bat, because what it's like to be something is something you can only know from the inside. Now, I think that essay, brilliant as it was, is criminally responsible for this entire study of consciousness, because it confuses the question, what is a mosquito like to a bat, with the question, what is it like to be a bat? The first one makes sense. I can ask, what is a sunset like? And I can tell you, it's kind of red and orange and beautiful. What's a mosquito like? It's small and buzzing and annoying. Or if a bat might say, no, a mosquito is like a delicious piece of candy. But if I then say, so what is it like for me to see a sunset? That's an illicit reification. Now I'm taking the properties of the object and trying to turn them into something in an inner world. This is the legacy of Augustine. It's the legacy of thinking that the way that we are in the world is that we replicate the outer world in an inner world of consciousness. And that's just a mistake. There's only one world, a world in which we as psychobiological organisms are firmly embedded. And yes, that means that we're conscious of things around us and conscious of things happening inside us. But it doesn't mean we've got some special thing called consciousness.
You pretty much answered my next question, which was to address this subjective experience or qualia that is also, of course, a big part of the talk about consciousness.
I think that's crazy. I think the idea that there are qualia is insane. There are qualities of things, each one of which is a relation between an object and a perceiver, not a thing, something in that thing. So I detect some qualities in external phenomena. Bats detect other ones. Bees detect other ones. But if I had to detect them by first having a quale, then I would then have to be conscious of that quale. And if the way that I'm conscious of something is by detecting its qualitative properties, I'd have to have a way of finding what the qualia of the qualia are. And now I'm off on a very nasty regress. And the moment you begin talking about qualia by interposing inner qualities between me and outer qualities, you've recreated that subject-object duality, and you've recreated now that idea of inner and outer, which is exactly the illusion to which most Buddhist philosophy of mind is directed. So one of the advantages from a Buddhist lens is you can stop asking these crazy questions and ask questions that actually have answers.
But then how would you interpret the Mary the Scientist thought experiment?
I would interpret that experiment in the following way. I would say that Mary acquires ways of interacting with the world that she didn't have before when she leaves the room. That's no surprise. We acquire new ways of interacting with the world all the time when we have new experiences. Mm-hmm. But that's not because she suddenly had qualia. It's because she was suddenly in a position to detect perceptible qualities of things that she had never detected before. And that kind of sounds boring, but sometimes the boring answer is the obvious answer. It doesn't help to interpose qualia in there. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. I mean, it is indeed a little bit of a boring answer to this thought experiment. Of course, it is much more interesting to debate all of the different theories that other people come with.
But that ends up being a rabbit hole from which there's no exit. Like I say, the grand origin of this is all the Tom Nagel essay. The moment we started asking, what is it like to be a subject? We reinscribed subject-object duality. And if you think that subject-object duality is the fundamental illusion, then you need to put your finger on every place where that illusion crops up. And Mary's another place.
Maybe for our very last question, I would ask for people who took away from this conversation that found themselves feeling a little bit uncomfortable after this conversation with the idea of the no self, this being a little bit destabilizing, a little bit terrifying. What would you say to them? And then also maybe I would ask for some book recommendation or some other scholars that are working on those kind of like your area or something that you think is valuable for us to go further on.
I would say that, the major thrust of my book is not just that the self is an illusion, but that when we shed that illusion, we can lead happier, more effective lives because we can come to know who we are and we can appreciate our genuine interdependence with everybody else and everything else. And that allows us to become more compassionate, more caring. It allows us to take our social nature more seriously, to understand our ethical lives better. And those are all good things. I think that this is a route to happiness, not a route to unhappiness. And if people want to read more from the Buddhist perspective about these things, well, one thing to do is to read some of the classical Buddhist treatises. Those are sometimes complex. But my colleague Bill Waldron has just written a beautiful book about the Yogacara school and about how consciousness is understood there, called Mind Only. And I forget what the subtitle is, but it's by William Waldron. That's a very beautiful book that I would recommend. Guy Newland's book, Introduction to Emptiness, Sonam Takcha's book, The Two Truths, are all great introductions to the way that Buddhists think about this. To look at it from the standpoint of cognitive science, I think that Thomas Metzinger's books, especially The Ego Tunnel, is a very accessible and beautiful book, and a book that really looks at the interface between cognitive science and Buddhism in thinking about selflessness. Evan Thompson's book, Waking, Dreaming, Being, is another very provocative book in this area. Dan Zahavi's books, maybe a little philosophically technical, but fascinating books in a slightly different perspective from my own. But I think it's worth looking at other people's perspectives as well as my perspectives. But this is
absolutely
stuff that's all worth thinking about. And it's worth reading as many perspectives as possible in order to get a triangulation.
I absolutely agree. Thank you very much for taking the time for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for giving us all the knowledge that you have.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. And I wish all of your listeners happy lives. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.